Welcome, friends. This episode we're doing some much needed maintenance on the WJ's engine, the 4-liter straight 6, which is actually the whole reason for choosing this model year range. When I was around 10 years old, I remember being told that Jeep engines will run forever if well maintained. And the image seared into my brain tied to that statement was a Jeep Wrangler with its hood open on a dealership lot, revealing a straight 6 4-liter engine. The next thing I remember was my mother saying something like, "Yeah, but I can't afford that." I've honestly held that in my mind as a fact. Jeep engines will run forever if well maintained. I've had many contrary observations over the past couple decades, but when my mother mentioned wanting to get an older Jeep, I started my search for the unstoppable Jeep power plant, which would, in fact, run forever. The engine was leaking oil down on the transmission bell housing, and I noticed that there was a leak coming from the back of the valve cover, so that gasket would need to be replaced before any further leak diagnosis could be completed. The Jeep has quite a few things around the valve cover which need to be removed. First up is the airbox cover and intake resonator. The airbox can be removed by using your hands or a flathead screwdriver to pop off the retaining clips outward. The hose clamp holding on the resonator can be accessed on the right side and loosened by using an 8mm socket and ratchet. The resonator is also held on by a 10mm bolt on the left-hand side. When I went to pull off the resonator to throttle body gasket, I noticed that several pieces of plastic from the resonator had broken off, and I would need to replace the resonator with one from the junkyard. Next thing I did was unbolt the throttle cable bracket from the intake manifold using a 10mm socket, long extension, and ratchet for both of those bolts. There are 3 cables running to the throttle body. The one closest to the throttle body is the actual throttle cable running to your pedal. The middle one is for cruise control, and then the farthest one from the throttle body is the throttle position cable for the transmission. The throttle cable pops right off with outward pressure, but the other 2 cables require you to remove tension and then slide them off toward the driver's side of the vehicle. If you try to pop them off directly, you're going to end up breaking them. After moving the throttle cables out of the way, it's a good idea to zip tie them up and out of the way. I didn't do that until later. But next for me, it was actually cleaning everything up. I wanted to vacuum as much crud out of the engine area as possible so nothing fell into the valve train after I removed the cover. I started disconnecting things from the valve cover so it would be easily removed. This includes removing the throttle cable retainer, the heater cool coolant hose retainer on the passenger side, and then I came to the fuel injector wiring. The ECU for the WJ is located just behind the coolant overflow reservoir on the passenger firewall. All the wiring to the engine runs from the ECU behind and on top of the valve cover and to the driver's side where all the sensors and actuators are actually located. The plastic loom which covers this wiring harness was brittle and falling apart with every movement. And since this harness also runs to the thermostat, intake manifold, and O2 sensors, I would have had to disconnect everything to move it out of the way. I didn't want to go through all that trouble for a simple 90-minute gasket replacement, so I left them in place and worked around everything. The valve cover has mostly standard bolts holding it in place, but there are a few stud bolts which retain the heater core, coolant hose, as well as the fuel injector harness, and there is an engine ground which was secured to a stud bolt with a nut. All the valve cover bolts are 11mm, and I needed to use a deep socket for those stud bolts. I learned from BMWs that the bad thing about having a straight 6 is how far back you have to reach for bolts on the valve cover. I had to stand on a stool and try various combinations of extensions, sockets, and adapters to get the right length for the limited space. I couldn't just pull the valve cover straight up because the firewall is in the way. The right way to do this is to disconnect the wiring harness from everything on the driver's side and zip tie it over on the passenger side. That way you can rotate the valve cover off to the right and pull it out. I had to struggle since I didn't do that until reinstallation. Next up was cleaning up all the brittle plastic that fell into the valve area, as well as cleaning the gasket mating surface. First with a rag, and then with some sandpaper. There isn't much room to work, so this took a while. When I cleaned the valve cover, I found a whole bunch of rust, so I figured I'd throw a fresh coat of engine enamel on it. And to do this right, I wanted to remove the crankcase vent and the PCV valve before prepping the surface. The rubber gaskets were too hard and brittle, so were the valves, so I ended up breaking both vent valves and I had to buy replacements. I tried to scrub off the surface rust with a Brillo pad, and then I realized that the rust was just really deep. I tried using a wire wheel next with a drill and then aircraft paint remover. I learned later that an angle grinder wire wheel should have been the right answer. After everything was cleaned up and prepped, I wiped it down with some acetone and put 3 heavy coats of VHT Wrinkle Plus on the valve cover. The can says to wait 48 hours, but you need at least 3 days, if not a week, plus heat to cure it. Next, I installed the new gaskets and valves. PCV valve goes in the front of the engine, and the CCV goes in the rear of the engine. I used some fresh oil to lube everything up and slide it in. I placed the new gasket on the engine before remembering to tape up the wiring harness, which was still dropping pieces of plastic down onto the valve train. I was about to reinstall the valve cover when I realized that I would tear up the fresh paint unless I disconnected and moved the wiring harness out of the way. I had to be careful with these connectors since they were really brittle from engine heat cycling. But the different clip sizes and locations made it easy to figure out where they went when I reconnected. But I didn't double check, and I ended up missing an upstream O2 sensor, which gave me a check engine light whenever I restarted it. I used a scanner, figured out that that was the issue, went down the harness from top to bottom, and found exactly what was disconnected. The thermostat housing still gave me some trouble, but with the harness out of the way, I could still install the valve cover much easier. I originally put the valve cover on with the new rubber washers installed on the valve cover, but I found out that's just a bad idea. They're going to pop off or move around, so make sure that you install each of those washers with the bolt whenever you go to put it back together. I made a wardrobe change here because I actually lost a bolt and had to run to the junkyard to grab a couple of extra bolts. I was actually really scared that maybe I dropped a bolt into the valve area, so I ended up taking the cover back off to check. You'll notice throughout this entire series that I do a very poor job of hardware management, and it gets me into trouble. If you can, grab some Ziplocs and a Sharpie and keep track of your bolts. Also, take photos or use cardboard to keep track of where each of those bolts go. You can Google the proper order of torquing the bolts, but the basic rule is crisscrossing the valve cover from the center, working outward. If you go from the outside in, you risk creating gaps underneath the valve cover. I torqued the cover down to 8 foot-pounds or 85 inch-pounds. Next, I cleaned up the intake manifold before installing a new heat shield. The heat shield kit came with covers for the injectors too, but I wanted to wait and install all of that stuff when the new injectors came in. So I went straight to reconnecting all of the wiring. The previous owner said that the throttle body needed to be cleaned, and since I was going to remove it to clean it, I decided to replace the gasket also. The throttle body is held on by 4 bolts, which require a 10mm socket to remove. I used normal sensor-safe intake cleaner from AutoZone, and after reinstalling the throttle body, I installed the used CCV hose that I got from the junkyard. I had to go through several Jeeps to find one in decent condition, but buying a new one would have been an extra $100 just for that hose. Next, it was time to reinstall the throttle cables and bracket. After reconnecting the throttle body sensors, I installed the used intake resonator and PCV hose, which I also got from the junkyard. I did a nice engine bay detail before installing the airbox and running the vehicle. Once the oil was warm, it was time for an oil and filter change. I've seen people say different things for oil and filters for this vehicle, but I went with brands available at AutoZone, and I used 6 quarts of 10W30. Based on the age of the vehicle, I thought new motor mounts were necessary to keep it in great shape for the next few years. I supported the engine from the oil pan, which is a little sketchy, and if I do this again, I'll use the 2x10 to disperse the weight, since I saw a decent amount of flex in the bottom, and these pans are very thin. I cut out literally over 2 hours on the front end of this, where I tried to figure out how to use an impact gun on the main support bolt. Ultimately, I used a ratcheting wrench and a 1/2-inch torqued wrench to loosen the nut. I hammered out the bolt thinking that there was enough support from the jack, but the reason it wasn't moving was because I needed more lift. Next, I used a ratchet and jack bar to loosen the 15mm bolts holding the mount onto the engine. The 2 bolts on the bottom I removed from underneath, and the top one I had to remove the airbox to reach from the top. The passenger side has much more room and was very easy to replace. The main support bolts, whenever I put everything back together, got torqued to 48 foot-pounds, and the bracket bolts are 40 foot-pounds. After running the Jeep, I noticed that there was some squealing coming from the idler pulley, and I saw the tensioner moving quite a bit. So I bought a pulley and belt kit to fix those issues. I used a 1/2-inch breaker bar to rotate the tensioner and remove the belt before replacing the pulleys. This was surprisingly easy. I didn't have anything strip out or stay stuck on. The tensioner pulley was a T40 Torx bit. I threw some anti-seize on the back of the tensioner, the new one, so that it wouldn't seize during future replacements. and I reused the old O-ring that was on the back of the bolt since the kit didn't have a replacement. The idler pulley required a 14mm socket. I reused the spacer and washer since the kit didn't have one with it. I panicked a little bit after reinstallation, and I took the pulley back off because there was an extra component in the kit that I thought I needed. But it turned out that it was for a different vehicle, so I ended up putting it all back together again. The new belt was a tight fit, but I got it on there, and I gave the engine a couple of false cranks before starting it to make sure that the belt was secure. During the valve cover install, I tried moving the heater core coolant hose and ended up with a permanent coolant leak from that hose. There was fresh coolant in the system, so I didn't want to mess with it at all, but I figured that I'd use the opportunity to replace the thermostat housing and thermostat before bleeding the system. First thing I did was drain the radiator coolant from the plug on the passenger side. Then I removed the heater core coolant hose and the upper radiator hose from the thermostat housing. I removed the temperature sensor wire, pulled the two 13mm bolts from the housing, and pulled the housing off. You'll notice that I left the belt on because I was lazy, but that was the wrong answer, and I ended up having to pull it off later anyway to clean the mating surface. I used a 19mm wrench to remove the temperature sensor, and since it's an NPT fitting, I just installed it right into the new housing. It is a really tight space to work in to clean off that mating surface, so using a wire wheel was really hard for me. I ended up using some scrapers and a heavy-duty scrub pad to clean the mating surface and had to vacuum all of the debris out. The thermostat housing kit came with a new gasket, but I've seen so many DIYs showing to use RTV as kind of an adhesive to hold the gasket in place, so I just did the same. I put the thermostat in first using a little bit of RTV, and then I put the housing in, and I torqued the bolts down to 13 foot-pounds or 156 inch-pounds. I reinstalled the hoses using a worm clamp on the heater core coolant hose, and I reinstalled the belt. I gave the engine 2 false cranks to make sure that the belt was on correctly, and then I started it up with fresh coolant in the radiator and a burping funnel attached to the top of the radiator. My only experience with cooling systems before this was working on BMWs, which had a closed system, which requires an electric bleeding procedure using a scanner. I kind of didn't know what I was doing here, so I just kept letting it run, thinking that longer is better, until, finally disaster struck. After this, I filled it back up, cleaned up the mess, and kept on moving. So, despite my best efforts with the valve cover gasket, the engine was still leaking, and I'd get a nice squirt after shutting off the engine. Apparently that means that it's the rear main seal. Now, I haven't driven the vehicle more than 300 feet since the oil change, but due to some unforeseen circumstances, the front axle was no longer under the engine. So this was the absolute best time to get the seal replaced and also get in a new oil pan gasket. I drained the oil using a 17mm socket and let the oil drain out all the way. When the oil was done draining, I secured the drain plug, took some pictures of where the oil pan stud bolts went, and then I started removing those bolts. When I got to the passenger side, I had difficulty removing the clips that held on the heat shielding for the O2 sensor wires. I thought that they would unscrew, but I ended up having to pry them off. I watched several DIYs for the rear main seal, but I always skipped the oil pan removal since I thought, you just remove the bolts and you drop the pan. It turns out that you're supposed to remove the starter and the bell housing cover first so that you don't struggle like an idiot, which is what I'm doing right here. After dropping the pan, I needed to remove the bearing cap brace in order to actually get to the rear main bearing cap. I believe that these bolts were a 14mm. The stud bolts on the rear main bearing cap itself are 21mm. After removing the bearing cap, I was able to get a look at the rear main seal. I didn't have a punch, so I ended up using a small hex head to push it out far enough to get some needle nose vice grips on. I was hella scared that I'd scratch something, so I went really slow. I had done the engine side first because I thought that that would be the hardest, but the cap side was way harder because I didn't have anything to brace it with. I wish that I had had a vise to work with. After getting the old one out, I oiled up the new seal and slid it into the cap side. It's really easy to get dirt on everything also, so I made sure to clean up the rest of the cap and bearing before moving to the engine side seal. The new seal comes with this shoehorn, which most DIYs either don't use or they use it incorrectly. I put the small side into the seal gap and slid the seal in while holding the bit of plastic horn. I took the shoehorn out early after getting it started, just like all the DIYs told me to, but that was a huge mistake, and the mating surface started immediately to cut into the new seal. I couldn't get the horn back in, so I had to carefully put pressure from the outside of the seal and slide it the rest of the way in without causing any more damage. Older engines have bearing cap side seals with ears which compress on the mating surface. The newer ones, though, require RTV to seal properly. I haven't had any luck using a nozzle for RTV since the tube always busts open, so I used my finger to try and smear some RTV on the mating surface here. While waiting for the RTV to harden up a bit, I finally pulled off that bell housing cover, which is held on by 3 13mm bolts. This cover has a tab on the top center, which helps hold on the oil pan. I also went to work cleaning up this mess of old congealed oil in the oil pan before reinstalling the bearing cap at 40, 70, and then 80 foot-pounds finally, and the brace at 35 foot-pounds. I then made a frustrating discovery of how loose my timing chain was. The tensioner is built into the timing chain cover, so this was hella loose and needed to be replaced. I absolutely did not want to remove the radiator, and I had seen a few DIYs where it seemed possible to pull off the timing cover without removing the radiator, so I went to work removing the mechanical and electric fans along with the fan shroud. The fan shroud and electric radiator are held on by 2 10mm bolts on either side. I learned that you first need to remove the top brace using a 10mm socket and the hood latch using a 13mm socket to allow the radiator to rotate forward to gain access to those lower bolts. Now, I already had the bumper, headlight, grille, and header panel out since they were busted, so this was easy for me. Removing all of that is a lot more work with a T30 Torx bit, a 7mm socket, and a 10mm socket, as well as a plastic rivet puller. That would take some time. I had hoped that I could just remove the shroud and electric fan and work around the mechanical fan, but I had to remove the mechanical fan. Pulling the fan from an E46 M3, you're able to use a long screwdriver for leverage against the fan, but I couldn't do that here. I had to run to the auto parts store, rent a fan tool, along with the fan wrench kit. The adjustable fan tool from O'Reilly's requires the use of opposing bolts and not parallel bolts. There isn't much space, so it takes patience. The fan nut itself requires a 36mm wrench. After removing the mechanical fan by rotating it counterclockwise, I found that it was still difficult to pull out the fan shroud due to various hoses in the way. I ended up pulling off the upper radiator hose to get it out. Next, I removed the water pump pulley using a 10mm socket on all 4 bolts, and then pulled the tensioner pulley out again using a T40 Torx bit. I removed the Harmonic Balancer bolt using an 18mm socket and impact, and then I rented a special Chrysler Harmonic Balancer removal tool from O'Reilly's, and then the Harmonic Balancer came right off super easy. The timing chain cover itself has 2 bolt sizes with multiple bolt lengths. The larger bolts are 16mm and the smaller are 10mm. I had to make sure I kept track of where each bolt went. Finally, I popped off the cover using a small pry tool and revealed the timing sprockets and chain. I put the Harmonic Balancer bolt back in and rotated the crankshaft until the sprocket timing marks were aligned. Then I wrestled with everything to remove the camshaft sprocket bolt. Once I fixed the timing marks again, I convinced the sprockets and chain to finally come off. The new and old chains only had a small difference in length, so there was probably a good decision to also replace the sprockets at the same time. I made the mistake of installing the new sprockets and chain before cleaning the cover mating surface, and this caused me heartache later trying to have room to clean it, and then also to vacuum out all the debris, because there was quite a bit. It was pretty bad. So now for arts and crafts, I cleaned off the cover side mating surface before realizing that I needed a new seal and gasket for the timing chain cover, which did not come with the chain and sprocket set. An hour or so later, and I had the new parts and went about installing them along with the plastic tensioner on the inside of the cover, and then I was back on track for reassembly of everything. Or so I thought. The engine side mating surface had an extremely thick layer of RTV stuck everywhere, and it took me a lot of time and patience to clean it. I had already installed the new sprockets and those things were stuck on good, so I could not remove them again without risking damage. So I ended up slowly cleaning off the old gasket and cleaning out the debris afterward. I reinstalled the camshaft sprocket bolt and torqued it to 50 foot-pounds before reinstalling the cover and torquing the bolts to 5 foot-pounds for the 10mm bolts and 16 foot-pounds for the 16mm bolts. I tried using the Harmonic Balancer install tool that I rented from O'Reilly's, but someone had previously rented it and broken the main bolt and then replaced that bolt with one that was way too short to work. I didn't want to delay this any longer, and I had recalled watching a DIY where the guy said, "Just whack it with a mallet." So I made the very expensive mistake of doing just that. The sad thing about this is that since I didn't remove the radiator, the mallet didn't even get the balancer back on. I only succeeded in putting a nice wobble in the balancer's operation, which I wouldn't even notice until later. I turned my attention to something trivial since I'd have to wait until the next day to get the install tool. The old drain plug was leaking, and I figured that if I had to replace it, I might as well install a Fumoto drain valve to make oil changes in the future easy. Next, I fixed some damage to the oil pan mating surface, which I'm not sure if I did or if it was already there. The Harmonic Balancer wasn't on yet, but the timing chain cover was, so I could finally install the oil pan after cleaning up the engine side mating surface. The Felpro gasket came with some fancy clips, which made it easy to line everything up, and even held the pan on while I started reinstalling the bolts, and torquing them to 7 foot-pounds for the small bolts, and 11 foot-pounds for the larger and longer ones, which go in the corners basically. I'll note that you should probably swipe some RTV on the seams between the block and the timing chain cover before you put on the gasket. Just like any other gasket and pan, there is a specific sequence for tightening and torquing the bolts. Like before, the basic premise is inside out and crisscross. The guys at O'Reilly's got me the new tool the very next day, so I threw some grease on the threads and pressed the balancer back on. Once I got the bolt and washer back in, I eventually learned to use a small pry bar to hold the balancer in place while I torqued the bolt to 80 foot-pounds. I put the water pump pulley back on and torqued the bolts to 17 foot-pounds. After swapping the thermostat housing, I had a leak from the upper radiator hose, so I took the opportunity to replace the clamp with a worm drive clamp before reassembling everything on the front end. Reassembly was basically the reverse of disassembly. I didn't pull exact torque specs on anything else, just made sure that they were tight enough before putting in fresh oil and coolant and starting her up. My antics with the mallet threw the outer and inner portion of the Harmonic Balancer out of alignment, which meant that it wobbled and I had to buy a new one. I had to disassemble the whole front end again and install the new Harmonic Balancer before reassembling everything a second time also. Alright, so on the money. The valve cover gasket, paint, PCV, and CCV parts along with a new intake resonator and air filter were $158 altogether. 2 engine oil changes and 1 filter change was $115. The thermostat kit plus coolant was $65. The rear main seal, oil pan gasket, and drain valve together were $93. And finally, the timing chain kit, gasket kit, and Harmonic Balancer together were just over $200. The episode total was $812, bringing our project total to $3,956. I'm adding a new metric of hours to this list, which we'll calculate a cost for at the end, but I had 8 hours of film from episodes 1 and 2 and 18 hours from this episode. The total of 26 hours is just for filming and doesn't include the research, finding parts, and quite a few things done off camera. My first takeaway from this episode is that I need to do more research before diving in. I have some experience on other vehicles, but that doesn't always translate to a vehicle that you're unfamiliar with. Doing the research will make sure that you don't break something during disassembly or reassembly, especially on an older vehicle with brittle parts. I definitely need to improve my patience while working on the vehicle also, but more recently I've been panicked just trying to get things done within a self-defined time frame. I have not been realistic with setting goals for myself, considering that I also have a full-time job. I also need to make sure that I wait for the right tool, even if that means renting it and planning ahead to replace everything all at once so that I don't have to remove a belt and pulley several times or disassemble the front end over and over again. The biggest takeaway for me, though, is that I can definitely physically accomplish the maintenance for this vehicle. I can do it. But it might not be feasible to do it for myself or for other people because renting some of the tools costs hundreds of dollars, which is not refunded for up to a week after you return the tool. The fixes also take so long, and if you don't have everything that you need, you could get stuck without a vehicle for weeks. For that reason, some of these fixes won't be possible on a daily driver. This was a packed episode, but there's even more fun ahead. Likely the most expensive episode is next because I'll be working on the rear axle, brakes, and suspension. Thanks for watching this episode, and I will see you next week.